Sleep paralysis. Those moments when you're awake but your body is frozen, unable to move. You're trapped, helpless, and often greeted by figures in the shadows, watching you, creeping closer. These are not just nightmares. They are encounters with something darker. I will share 3 stories that still haunt me to this day. I warn you, after hearing these, you might never want to sleep again. It was a chilly evening in July, and I was exhausted after a long day at work. My eyes were heavy as I climbed into bed, eager for sleep to take over. Little did I know that night would be the first of many where I would come face to face with something I couldn't explain. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. My room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, they were all paralyzed. I panicked, my heart racing as I struggled against my own body. But it was no use. That's when I saw it. In the corner of my room, just out of the reach of the moonlight, was a figure. At first, it was just a shadow, something that could easily be mistaken for a trick of the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it was watching me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silently staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I couldn't scream. I was completely helpless. Minutes felt like hours as the figure remained in the corner. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I dreaming? But no, this felt too real, too vivid. I could feel the sweat dripping down my forehead, the weight of the blankets on my body. This was no dream. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it inch closer. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to move, to run, but I was trapped. I could only watch as the shadow crept closer and closer. The figure stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me. I could barely breathe as it leaned in, its face just inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of my room. I closed my eyes, praying for it to go away. But when I opened them again, it was still there. It whispered something I couldn't understand, but the sound of its voice sent chills down my spine. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with words. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what it was saying, but the fear was too overwhelming. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, as it whispered its haunting words. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. My body jerked, and I could move again. I sat up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, but there was no sign of the figure. It was as if it had never been there at all. For days after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboard sent a wave of panic through me. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. That figure was real, and it had seen me. I started sleeping with the lights on, hoping that the brightness would keep the figure away, but it didn't help. Every night I would wake up paralyzed, and every night the figure would be there, watching me from the corner of the room. It never got any closer than the first night, but its presence was enough to drive me to the edge of madness. I began to dread going to sleep. The exhaustion weighed on me, but the thought of encountering that figure again was too terrifying. I tried everything, sleeping pills, meditation, even talking to a doctor, but nothing worked. The figure was always there, lurking in the shadows. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the figure. If it was going to haunt me, I needed to know what it wanted. That night, I went to bed determined. When I woke up paralyzed, I wasn't scared. I was ready. The figure was there, as usual, standing in the corner of the room. I focused all my energy on moving, trying to break free from the paralysis. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to move my hand. I pointed at the figure and whispered, "What do you want?" For the first time, the figure responded. It stepped closer, its form becoming clearer in the darkness. It leaned in, its face just inches from mine, and whispered, You. My heart dropped. The word echoed in my mind, chilling me to my core. You. I didn't know what that meant, but I could feel the weight of its presence, like a black cloud settling over me. The figure leaned in closer, so close I could feel its icy breath against my skin. Its shadowy form blurred the line between reality and nightmare. I tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted from me, but the words were stuck in my throat. All I could do was lie there, trapped under its gaze. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving me gasping for breath. The room felt lighter, but my mind was still heavy with fear. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure, heard its raspy voice whispering in my ear. You. The word haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream, that whatever it was real, and it wasn't done with me yet. The next day I tried to go about my usual routine, but everything felt off. I was exhausted, my mind clouded by the events of the night before. At work, I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to focus on anything. Every shadow in the office felt like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, I dreaded going to bed. The fear of seeing that figure again was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't stay awake forever. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I found myself drifting off to sleep. But as expected, I woke up in the middle of the night, paralyzed once again. The figure was there, standing in the corner of my room. This time it didn't move. It just watched me, its presence heavier than ever before. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I couldn't make a sound. All I could do was lie there, helpless, as the figure loomed over me. Night after night, the figure returned, always standing in the same corner of my room. It never came any closer, but its presence was enough to fill me with dread. The sleepless nights were taking a toll on me. I became withdrawn, jumpy, always on edge. My friends noticed the change, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what was happening. They wouldn't believe me, I was sure of it. I started researching sleep paralysis, trying to find an explanation for what I was experiencing. Everything I read told me the same thing. It was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by my body's inability to move. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, the fear remained. Deep down, I knew that what I was seeing was real. One night, after weeks of torment, I decided to try something different. I set up a camera in my room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the figure. Maybe if I could see it on film, I would finally have proof that I wasn't going crazy. I went to bed that night with a strange mix of fear and anticipation, wondering what the camera would capture. The next morning, I woke up feeling more drained than ever. The figure had appeared again as expected, but this time it felt different. It was more oppressive, its presence heavier than before. I was almost too afraid to check the footage, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened my laptop and played the recording from the night before. At first, everything seemed normal, just me, lying in bed, tossing and turning as I tried to fall asleep. But then, around the time I usually experienced the paralysis, something changed. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, darkening in the corner where the figure always stood. My heart raced as I watched the shadow grow larger, taking on the form of the figure I had seen night after night. It wasn't just a hallucination, it was real. The figure lingered in the corner for what felt like an eternity before slowly fading back into the darkness. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. I wasn't crazy. The figure was real, and it had been watching me all along. With proof in hand, I didn't know what to do. Who would believe me? Who could help? I considered reaching out to a priest or maybe a psychic, but something about the figure felt too powerful for even that. I was terrified, yes, but part of me knew that running or seeking help wouldn't solve this. Whatever it was, it had chosen me for a reason, and it wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. That night, I prepared myself for another encounter. I didn't sleep, not really. I waited. I wanted answers. And sure enough, when the paralysis hit, the figure returned. But this time I wasn't scared. I forced myself to meet its gaze, to look into the depths of its shadowy form. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why me?" The figure didn't answer, not with words. Instead, it stepped forward, closer than it had ever been before. I braced myself, expecting to feel its icy breath on my skin again, but instead I felt something warm, a hand, resting gently on my forehead, and then everything went black. The second time I experienced sleep paralysis was even more terrifying than the first. This time, it wasn't a shadowy figure watching me from the corner of the room. It was something far more sinister, a woman's voice whispering in my ear. It started on a night like any other. I'd been sleeping soundly when I suddenly woke up, unable to move. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something out of place, but everything seemed normal. That's when I heard it. The soft, raspy sound of a woman's voice right next to my ear. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone of her voice sent chills down my spine. It was as if she was trying to tell me something important. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't understand her. The whispers continued for what felt like hours. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even scream. All I could do was listen as the woman's voice filled my ears, growing more frantic with each passing second. It was as if she was pleading with me, begging me to do something, but I didn't know what. I wanted to respond, to ask her who she was and what she wanted from me, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, trapped in that awful state between sleep and wakefulness. The only thing I could do was lie there, helpless, as the whispers grew louder and louder until they were all I could hear. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. My body jerked awake and I sat up, gasping for breath. The room was silent, the air still, but the memory of the woman's voice lingered, haunting me long after the paralysis had faded. The next few nights were restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's voice was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faintest whisper, just out of reach. It was as if she was waiting for me, waiting for the right moment to return. And return she did. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night, paralyzed once again. The whispers started almost immediately, the woman's voice more insistent this time. I still couldn't make out what she was saying, but the urgency in her tone was unmistakable. She needed something from me, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. Desperation clawed at my chest as I tried to move, to scream, to do anything to break free from the paralysis. But it was no use. The whispers continued, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. It was as if the woman's voice was inside my head, echoing through my mind. The whispers tormented me night after night. Every time I fell asleep, I knew it was only a matter of time before the woman's voice returned. The lack of sleep was driving me to the edge of madness. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think clearly. All I could hear were those whispers, playing over and over in my mind. I started to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. Was the woman's voice real, or was it just a figment of my imagination? But deep down I knew the truth. The whispers were real, and they weren't going away anytime soon. One night, after weeks of torment, I decided to try something different. Instead of fighting the paralysis, I decided to embrace it. I wanted to know what the woman was trying to tell me, to understand her message. So, when the whispers started again, I didn't resist. I let the woman's voice fill my mind, focusing all my attention on her words. And then, finally, I heard it. The whispers, once garbled and unintelligible, became clear. The woman's voice was soft, but her words were unmistakable. She was calling my name. Over and over again, she whispered my name, as if trying to get my attention. But that wasn't all. As the whispers grew louder, I began to hear something else. A name, repeated over and over again. A name I didn't recognize, but one that sent chills down my spine. "Find him," the woman whispered, her voice urgent. "Find him before it's too late." And just like that, I woke up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent. but the woman's words echoed in my mind. Find him. But who was she talking about? And why did she need me to find him? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore the whispers any longer. The woman's voice haunted me. Her urgent whisper, "Find him," echoed in my mind day and night. But who was him? I had no idea where to start, or even if this was something I should pursue. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind, some strange concoction of my subconscious. But the intensity of her voice, the way she seemed desperate, it made me feel like I had no choice but to listen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far beyond my control. My sleep became erratic, my days filled with anxiety. I avoided telling anyone about what I was experiencing, fearing they would dismiss it as stress or a lack of sleep. But this wasn't just stress. It felt like I was being called to do something I didn't understand. So I started searching. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I figured I would know it when I saw it. I combed through old news articles, stories of missing people, anything that might explain who the woman was talking about. But every lead I found turned into a dead end. The more I searched, the more lost I felt. One night, after hours of fruitless research, I fell into a restless sleep. I didn't expect the whispers to return, but they did, louder than ever before. This time, though, there was something different. I could feel her presence, not just hear her voice. It was as if she was standing right beside me, her breath on my neck. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "find him before it's too late." There was an urgency in her voice that I hadn't heard before, a desperation that made my heart race. I wanted to ask her who she was talking about, but I couldn't speak. I could only listen as she repeated the same phrase over and over again. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. My body jolted awake and I gasped for breath. The room was dark, silent, but her voice still lingered in my mind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out who she was talking about, even if it meant diving into something I didn't fully understand. The next day I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the woman's voice, her pleading whispers. I felt like I was on the brink of discovering something important, something that could change everything. But what? I had no clues, no leads, nothing to guide me. That evening I sat down at my desk, determined to find something, anything that could help me. I started digging through local history, looking for unsolved mysteries, missing persons cases, anything that might be connected to the whispers. Hours passed as I scrolled through articles and old reports, my eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. And then, I found it. An article from years ago about a missing boy. His name was Joseph, and he had disappeared without a trace from a small town not far from where I lived. The case had gone cold, and no one had seen or heard from him since. But something about his story struck a chord with me. Could this be who the woman was talking about? Was this the person I was supposed to find? I didn't know if Joseph was the one the woman was referring to, but it was the only lead I had. I decided to follow it, hoping it would bring me some answers. The next day, I drove to the town where Joseph had lived, a quiet, sleepy place with an unsettling stillness about it. As I walked through the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like someone or something was following me. I made my way to the old house where Joseph had lived. It was abandoned now, the windows boarded up, the garden overgrown with weeds. But as I stood in front of it, I felt a strange pull, like I was being drawn inside. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, urging me forward. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was where I was supposed to be. I found an open window and climbed inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was dark and cold, the air thick with dust. As I made my way through the empty rooms, the whispers grew louder, guiding me towards something important. In the back of the house, I found a small door that led to the basement. The whispers were almost deafening now, filling my mind with their urgency. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and descended into the darkness. The basement was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I could barely see anything, but I could feel the presence of something or someone watching me. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its light to illuminate the space. And that's when I saw it, a small, dusty box hidden in the corner of the room. I hesitated for a moment, but then I reached for it, my hands shaking. As I opened the box, a wave of cold air rushed over me, and the whispers suddenly stopped. Inside the box was an old photograph, faded with age. It was a picture of a young boy, Joseph. But there was something else, too. A note scrawled in shaky handwriting. It read, "Find him before it's too late." The words sent chills down my spine. This was it. This was what the woman had been trying to tell me. But what did it mean? And why was she so desperate for me to find him? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. The whispers were real, and whatever was happening, it wasn't over yet. Holding the photograph and note in my trembling hands, I felt a mix of confusion and dread. The whispers had led me here, but now I was left with more questions than ever. Who had left the note? Was it the woman who whispered in my sleep? And what had happened to Joseph? I decided to take the photograph and the note with me. Maybe someone in the town still remembered Joseph and could help me piece together what had happened to him. As I left the old house, the air felt heavy, like the weight of the past still lingered in the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that didn't want me to uncover the truth. I hurried to my car, eager to leave the house and its secrets behind. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel that I was only scratching the surface of a much deeper mystery. The next day, I returned to the town and began asking around about Joseph. Most people didn't remember much, or they were reluctant to talk about it. The case was old, nearly forgotten, and it seemed like the town had moved on. But there was one person who hadn't, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ada, who had lived in the town her entire life. Mrs. Ada was cautious at first, but when I showed her the photograph of Joseph, her eyes softened, and she invited me into her home. She remembered Joseph well. He had been a bright, friendly boy who lived just down the street from her. His disappearance had shaken the town to its core, and for a long time people had searched for him, hoping he would be found alive. But as the years passed, hope faded, and the town eventually moved on. As Mrs. Ada spoke, I could hear the faintest whispers in the back of my mind, urging me to listen closely. She mentioned something strange. A few weeks before Joseph disappeared, he had told her about a woman who would visit him in his dreams. She was always whispering something to him, but he could never understand what she was saying. Mrs. Ada had dismissed it as a child's imagination at the time, but now it seemed like more than just a coincidence. The mention of the whispering woman sent chills down my spine. Could it be the same woman who had been haunting my sleep? I pressed Mrs. Ada for more details, but she didn't know much else. Joseph's parents had never spoken about the whispers, and after he disappeared, they had left the town, unable to bear the pain of staying in the place where they had lost their son. I thanked Mrs. Ada for her time and left her house, feeling more unsettled than ever. The connection between Joseph and the woman in my dreams was undeniable, but what did it all mean? And why was she so desperate for me to find him? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The woman's voice was clearer now, her words sharper. "Find him," she repeated over and over again. "Find him before it's too late." I knew I couldn't ignore her any longer. Whatever had happened to Joseph, the woman in my dreams wanted me to uncover the truth. But the deeper I delved into the mystery, the more dangerous it felt. Something dark was lurking just beneath the surface, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching my every move. The next day, I decided to visit the old cemetery on the edge of town. Mrs. Ada had mentioned that some of the townspeople believed Joseph's spirit lingered there, unable to rest. I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, but after everything I had experienced, I was willing to consider the possibility. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the headstones weathered and worn with age. As I walked through the rows of graves, I felt a strange sense of unease, like the air was charged with energy. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I hoped that somehow I would find a clue that would lead me closer to the truth. And then, I saw it. A small, unmarked grave in the far corner of the cemetery. The earth around it looked disturbed, like it had been dug up recently. My heart raced as I approached it, a sense of dread settling in my chest. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more frantic, urging me forward. I knelt beside the grave and brushed away the loose dirt, revealing a simple stone marker with no name, only the initials JB. Could this be Joseph's grave? If so, why was it unmarked? And who had disturbed it? As I stood over the grave, I felt a sudden chill, as if a cold wind had swept through the cemetery. The whispers in my mind grew louder, almost deafening, and I could hear the woman's voice more clearly than ever before. "You're close," she whispered. "So close." I didn't know what to do next. The answers felt just out of reach, but I knew I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what had happened to Joseph and why the woman in my dreams was so desperate for me to find him. That night, the whispers returned with a vengeance. The woman's voice was no longer soft and pleading. It was harsh, commanding, almost angry. "Find him," she demanded. "Find him before it's too late." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark and silent, but I could still hear her voice echoing in my mind. I had to act fast. Whatever was happening, time was running out, and I was the only one who could stop it. The third encounter with sleep paralysis came during a time in my life when I thought I had finally escaped the nightmares. After months of torment from the shadowy figure and the whispering woman, I had begun to sleep peacefully again. But it didn't last. Something even darker was waiting for me. Something far more terrifying than I could have imagined. It started on a night like any other. I had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from a long day of work. But in the middle of the night, I woke up with that familiar, horrifying feeling of being completely paralyzed. My body wouldn't move, my voice wouldn't work. I was trapped in my own skin, unable to do anything but wait. But this time there was no shadow in the corner of the room, no whispering voice in my ear. Instead, I saw something far more sinister, a dark, human-like figure standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes were glowing red and its presence was suffocating. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, filling the room with a sense of dread so powerful it made me want to scream. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me with those red, glowing eyes. I tried to look away, to break free from its gaze, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on it, drawn to the darkness that seemed to seep from its very being. And then slowly the figure began to move. It didn't walk. It glided, as if it were floating above the ground. It came closer, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart pounded in my chest and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was completely helpless, trapped in my own nightmare. The figure loomed over me, its face just inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, and the air around me grew colder. I wanted to close my eyes, to block out the sight of it, but I couldn't. I was forced to watch as it leaned closer, its red eyes burning into mine. As the figure hovered over me, I could feel its presence growing stronger. It was as if it were feeding off my fear, growing more powerful with every passing second. I could barely breathe, the air in the room feeling thick and heavy. The figure's face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes were like burning coals, piercing through me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then it spoke. Its voice was deep, almost inhuman, and it seemed to echo in my mind rather than in the room. "I've been watching you," it said, its words sending chills down my spine. "You belong to me now." I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but I couldn't. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, as the figure continued to speak. "You will never escape me," it whispered, its voice filled with malice. "I am always with you, even when you cannot see me." The weight of its words settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I felt a deep sense of despair wash over me. Was this it? Was I doomed to be haunted by this dark figure for the rest of my life? I didn't know what to do, and the fear was overwhelming. The figure remained by my side for what felt like hours, whispering terrible things into my mind. It told me that it had been watching me for a long time, waiting for the right moment to strike. It said that it fed on my fear, that every time I was afraid, it grew stronger. I could feel its presence growing more powerful with every word it spoke, and I knew that I couldn't let this continue. I had to find a way to break free from its hold, to escape the nightmare that had taken over my life. But how? I was completely paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The figure's voice was like a poison, filling my mind with darkness and despair. It felt like I was drowning in my own fear, unable to find a way out. And then, something strange happened. A small, quiet voice deep within me began to fight back. It was barely a whisper at first, but it grew stronger with every passing second. It told me not to give up, not to let the darkness consume me. It reminded me that I was stronger than this, that I could break free if I just fought hard enough. With all the strength I could muster, I focused on that small, quiet voice inside me. I pushed back against the fear, against the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. It wasn't easy. The figure's presence was overwhelming, and the weight of its words was almost unbearable. But slowly, I began to feel a shift. The figure's hold on me weakened, just enough for me to move my fingers. It was a small victory, but it gave me hope. I focused all my energy on that tiny movement, determined to break free from the paralysis that had gripped me. The figure seemed to sense what I was doing, and it grew more frantic. Its whispers became louder, more urgent, but I didn't listen. I focused on the voice inside me, the one telling me that I could fight back, that I could win. And then finally I did. With one final push, I broke free from the paralysis and sat up in bed, gasping for air. The figure was gone, the room was quiet, and I was free. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder that the darkness was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again.